So where's the Luna fan club? I heard we got a couple of fans here. The Admiral's a hard act to follow because she took two shots at both my profession as a lawyer, military lawyer at some point, and also a Marine who have an aggressive nature. It's wonderful to be back here at the Air Force Academy. We had the opportunity to bring all of our, I guess what you would call command staff, all the members of our senior executive service here this summer to do some work with your institute, talking about leadership fundamentals, and I think that led to the invite to come back out here and talk to you all. I kind of had some questions early on about what do they want me to talk about. I fancy myself a student of leadership for my whole life, even before I put on the uniform. You know, I grew up, my dad was in the Air Force. That seems to be a theme already. He's in the Air Force. I grew up in Keesler Air Force Base and Lackland Air Force Base. I remember ants that bit you in San Antonio and shaking out your shoes for the scorpions. My dad said the worst decision he ever made in his life was to get out of the Air Force, and he always talked fondly about it. So I think he maybe planted the seed a little bit for the career path I went on, and trying to think what would be relevant to the majority of the audience here, which are cadets on the cusp of starting down the path of being officers in the United States Air Force and having the responsibility for leading individuals in defense of this country. How can I make this relevant to them without sort of rehashing things that you have discussed in the course of your classes, things that you've studied, things that are at the core of the Institute in this forum for the next couple of days, and translated so that you can have a couple of takeaways and maybe, just maybe, be a little bit inspired about the relevance of what you do today to things that will happen in your lives, personally and professionally, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years from now. Can I get slide one? I hesitated to bring this up. I don't show this to a lot of people, but I share it with you because that's newly minted Second Lieutenant B.T. Jones in Quantico in the summer at the end of OCS at Brown Field in 1982. I was a law student. I spent my summer between my second and third year of law school at Brown Field. I'd already been out of college, so I was one of the older people in the class, in the series, and that was a long, long, hot summer. It was OCS. And I put that up there because there are lessons that I learned that summer, not that I came to the table completely empty with some of the things that you've discussed and will continue to discuss, but there are lessons that I learned that summer that were, as in Marine speak, were implanted in my brain housing group that I have called on over the course of a career now of 35 years in the public and private sector. You know, I couldn't wait to get out of there. I think I gave the silver dollar to my platoon sergeant for giving me the first salute, and then went back to Minnesota, where I was married 2 years and was finishing the third year of law school and trying to get my head back wrapped around law school for the last year, which was difficult. But the lessons that I learned about the fundamentals of leadership during that experience, which is not unlike, you do a 4-year drag here, but the Marine Corps matriculation process, OCS, all Marine officers go to TBS. We have boat schoolers or Annapolis grads that are there, but it's kind of unique in terms of the matriculation process because whether you're going to be a pilot, a grunt, a tanker, a cannon cocker, or a lawyer, everybody goes to Quantico for those 6 months at the basic school. And between OCS and the basic school, I acquired some fundamentals in leadership that have served me well over the last 35 years. Can I get the next slide, please? This is a shot of me 3.5, almost 4 years ago. The person next to me is my boss, the Attorney General of the United States. I am the U.S. Attorney in the District of Minnesota, so I'm not responsible for the weather, but I get it. And I'm walking into ATF headquarters for the first time with the Attorney General. Somebody took that shot. I'm going down to the auditorium to address via VTC and people there in headquarters. ATF headquarters, a standalone building in Washington, D.C. up in New York Ave. Fairly new, nice auditorium. But I'd never been in headquarters. Never been in that building. I was a United States Attorney 2 years into it, second rodeo. I was a U.S. Attorney in the 90s during the Clinton administration. Both are political appointments. In between time, I spent time at a big law firm, at a small litigation boutique, doing criminal defense work, internal investigations. Most of the 90s was with the Department of Justice as a line assistant in AUSA. I was in the Marine Reserves, stayed in, and as long as I could as a lawyer. It gets kind of tough in the Marine Corps in the middle of the country with no beaches. But so I'd had a lot of experience in the Department of Justice as a federal prosecutor. If you were to ask me today, I'm a trial lawyer, federal prosecutor, line assistant, first assistant, U.S. Attorney, second tour. I got a really tough mission from the Attorney General of the United States in the summer of 2011 to go down into this organization, which is a very fine federal law enforcement agency, one of 4 in the Department of Justice, along with the FBI, the DEA, and the U.S. Marshal Service, to fix it because it was broke. It was in the throes of a controversy involving firearms trafficking on the southwest border. The previous director had been asked to leave, and quite frankly, folks were struggling about what we were going to do to get ATF, which is a vital piece of the Department of Justice's law enforcement effort in the fight against violent gun crime, arson, explosives. If you got any familiarity with federal law enforcement, you know that ATF is the closest thing to the blue-collar feds. We primarily work violent crime and gangs and guns, and we also have responsibility for regulating the firearms industry, which, quite frankly, draws a lot of fire for a lot of different reasons. So it was a tough spot. Probably the toughest leadership challenge I have ever had. You know, at times, going back to the Quantico days, one of the things that's imprinted through that process, and the Admiral said Marines have an aggressive nature, and this isn't, a shot at anything else, but one thing that's at the core, fidelity, courage, loyalty, commitment, the esprit de corps of the Marine Corps, the one thing that is, Marines never, ever, ever quit. And I can tell you over the last 3 years, there's been some challenges that have gotten me right up to the edge, and a lot of folks that I know that are in the first Civ Div are talking about, why are you hanging in there? This is a great organization. This was the first day I'm walking in, and I'm thinking to myself, how am I going to get this crew on the straight and narrow? Next slide, please. This gent right here is Tom Brandon. He is, and the Admiral talked about it, and I'm sure you've heard it, and we'll hear it from other speakers, about one of the fundamentals of leadership. You are not doing it by yourself. Finding people who have similar values, that are focused on the mission, that are good teammates, are absolutely essential to getting any kind of job done and being an effective leader. Let me tell you a little bit about Tom Brandon. I did not know. Just like walking into ATF headquarters was first time. One of the first things I did, because of the nature of the problem and the assessment that I did, was get on a plane and go to the Phoenix Field Division, which was ground zero for some of the controversy. Tom Brandon had been there about 3 months. He was the member of the senior executive service, the special agent in charge in Detroit, who was sent to Phoenix to stop the bleeding. Lots of drama going on there for a lot of different reasons. And so I went down to Phoenix. I had a town hall, bring all the personnel in, all the gun toters, all the agents, all the investigators, all the regulators, the support staff, really tough town hall to do a temperature and pulse to see really at ground zero what was going on. And I spent an hour with Tom Brandon, and he had his finger on the pulse. He'd been with the Bureau for over 25 years, career agent, variety of jobs, and a tremendous example of a servant leader. And he gave it to me raw and uncut. First time we met. Spent an hour together, and I'm trying to figure out what's going to go on a national level. He's been doing things on the division level. And at the end of the meeting, I said, Tom, I need you in Washington. I need you to come up and be my deputy director, because the boss basically gave me a blank check. Fix it. And so Tom did another PCS move. You all will appreciate this. Second PCS in 6 months. Packed his trash, came to D.C. I found out after that meeting that Tom Brandon turned 18 on the drill fields at Parris Island. That to his parents' chagrin, he had joined the Marine Corps and went down to Parris Island. They signed the waiver and had spent the first 4 years before he joined ATF in the Marine Corps as an enlisted guy, got out as a sergeant, and was on embassy duty. In hindsight, I think one of the takeaways for your purposes and for the learning point with this particular situation is putting together a team, having, what did the Admiral call it, your battle buddy, is again absolutely essential to being able to address really tough issues and lead people in a time of crisis and stress. You cannot do this alone. Having shared values, having somewhat of a similar experience coming out of the Marine Corps together, and having a view of servant leadership that was in sync was absolutely essential to Deputy Director Brandon and I starting to construct a team. Because over the next several months, we had the opportunity, whether you want to call it an opportunity or the duty, to do a lot of transition at a lot of different levels. Now, currently, 23 out of the 25 special agents in charge at ATF are new. We revamped the whole team in Washington, D.C. for the most part. All the assistant directors and the deputy assistant directors are not the people that were there when we came on board in 2011. Now, this isn't like the military, where, you can chop PCS orders. There's an art to managing federal employees, and to do so in an environment that was quite delicate, involving whistleblowers and misconduct and all kinds of things. But we could not have done it individually. And we put together a solid team. Learning lesson, fundamental, teamwork makes the dream work. Whether you're in uniform or out, whether you're in the private sector or the public sector, law enforcement or the military, if you cannot identify talent, surround yourself with talented people with complementary skill sets, and construct a team, you will not have effective leadership in an organization. Next slide, please. I put this up here because after the team was put together and we're doing our SWOT analysis and trying to figure out what we're going to do, what works, what doesn't, really on a 911 kind of situation. Deputy Director Brandon and we have some other folks. We did not do this alone. Lots of transitions going on. I get a call because I'm still doing 2 jobs, U.S. Attorney in Minnesota and also the acting director of ATF. That's me presenting a flag to Dory Capano. Now, hopefully, none of you will have to do this, but the probabilities are that you may, if you haven't already, been at a funeral of a public servant, in this case, her husband, Special Agent John Capano, who was killed intervening in a pharmacy robbery a couple of miles from their home while he was off duty on Long Island in New York. Now, it had been 1993 at Waco since ATF had lost an agent in the line of duty. I'm 4 months into the gig, and I've got to go to a funeral. And if you've never been to a cop funeral, it's not unlike a military funeral with full honors. John Capano was shot intervening in a pharmacy robbery, the first time ATF had lost a special agent line of duty in many, many years. And here's the new director presenting a flag to Dory and Natalie and John, his son with the rose, who as of 6 months ago is now a New York police officer. And I've stayed in touch with them. And that was one of the most difficult things I did in my career. Given the eulogy, I was new to the organization, and everybody was in a very high level of distress. I just saw Dory a couple of weeks ago when John was awarded the Medal of Valor, which is the highest civilian honor that can be given to a law enforcement, a public safety officer, firefighter, or police officer, and they're in a good place now. But that was difficult. I put that slide up there, getting back to the fundamentals. One of the early lessons I learned, both at TBS, OCS, that you're learning here, and when I got out to the fleet, I went to 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. I dropped my law contract. I went open contract. I know that some of you are in the throes of trying to figure out what your MOS is. I'm just a dumb grunt, because I dropped my contract with a guarantee to be a lawyer. I dropped it at TBS. When open, I could have been a motor T, cannon cocker, because I wanted to be a grunt. I got lucky. I got my MOS. In the first 3 years I was in the Marine Corps, I had the opportunity to lead Marines at both the platoon and company level before I got sent to the force shop to be the alpha, which was a horrible job. But the lesson that this slide is up there, the fundamental lesson that I will never forget, that I learned early on that you should never forget, is know your men, know your people, know your command. I got to visit people in the New York Field Division and spend some quality time with them under a state of duress. And over the next year, I went to every field division at ATF. Every field division. Talked to the leadership, sometimes changed the leadership, sometimes brought new leadership in with me, but more importantly, talked to the secretaries, the investigators, the agents, got a sense of what was going on, what their needs were, where they were at. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, in doing that, knowing your folks, getting to know your folks, listening, there were ideas that were generated. There was a comfort level that I obtained about what was going on in Phoenix was not bureau-wide, that ATF was functioning at a high level in places all across the country. But none of that would have happened by sitting in an office in headquarters in Washington, D.C. Knowing your people, understanding where they're coming from, listening to them, letting them know that you care about their concerns, however minute, was a big part of getting everything right from an institutional level. Next slide, please. Elliot Ness. One of the things that they inculcate you with, both at this academy, all the service academies that the military does, is Air Force customs, courtesies, traditions, history. You know, I watched the other night before I came down here, just for you all, that I think is one of the finest leadership movies ever, 12 O'Clock High. You all have probably seen it 1,000 times. And I thought when General Savage walked into the 9/18 ready room for the first time, I thought about going down those steps and going into ATF for the first time. Just raw, under a situation that's not good and people don't know who the heck you are. Customs, courtesies, traditions are things that in the first civ div, in the civilian world, some organizations, high-performing organizations, are very good drawing on history in order to not only take lessons about the culture of the organization, but also to draw strength about getting through tough times. I put Elliot Ness up there for a couple of reasons. That's the real Elliot Ness. That's not Kevin Costner, obviously. That's not the untouchable that's in the movies or was on the TV series. That's the real Elliot Ness. He was about 27 years old, He was a special agent in Chicago, and he really did work with the United States Attorney there, U.S. Attorney Wilson, to bring down Al Capone and the outfit at the back end of Prohibition. Those creds right there, which I have reproduced and put in the lobby at ATF, say Department of Justice on them. Because for a brief period of time, right before Prohibition ended, ATF's legacy bureau, which was the Bureau of Prohibitions, which had a checkered history. You all have seen some of the gangster flicks. He was a probie in the Department of Justice, responsible for putting together a case against Al Capone. That's a historical point of reference that was really important for the organization to remember about where they came from. ATF and its legacy agencies, the Bureau of Prohibition, and those agencies in the Treasury Department have been around since 1862, collecting revenue, enforcing prohibition law, collecting taxes primarily. In 68, they got responsibility for the Gun Control Act, among other things, and so it's really morphed into a violent crime bureau. And folks there needed to be reminded, because you get beat up so long, if you don't have something to draw on in times of crisis, in terms of historical legacy, it gets difficult sometimes just to lean on the person to your left and your right. So we've done a lot of work reminding folks about that historical legacy, and that's been very valuable to folks within ATF in getting grounded and staying focused. Historical legacy. Air Force has a proud tradition. I know the class of '59 is here. I also know that it's a new branch of the service, but you all know the history. And you know that in tough times, how many times have you heard somebody whisper in your ear some historical anecdote about tough times in the past? You can draw on that, and I have drawn on that experience of historical legacy and grounding to work on that infamous morale issue. Next slide, please. This is a shot of Sonarev, who is the younger brother of the terrorist who was killed in the Boston Marathon bombing. That's an ATF medic who's working with him. That was in 2013. In April, I believe, that was the takedown. Some of you may be from Boston, may know the sequence of events. I spent about 48 hours in ATF headquarters in the room that we have, the operations center, monitoring events, trying to find and locate, figure out what happened at the Boston Marathon bombing. We worked very closely with the FBI and the Massachusetts State Police and saved that kid's life. He's on trial now in Boston. Lots of drama surrounding that. I put that slide up there to remind myself and also to illustrate the fact that, you've got to not only know your people, you've got to trust your people that they know what they're doing. And you've got to stress collaboration. One of the things that I noticed over my time as a federal prosecutor is sometimes, much like in the military, there's institutional equities and friction that goes on between the various law enforcement entities, FBI, DEA, the whole alphabet soup. Not unlike the phenomena that's much better now than it was 50 years ago with respect to the intra-service and inter-service rivalry. The things that and the path that we're on in the civilian, law enforcement, federal sector, the military has shown the way in terms of interoperability and joint ops. There are lessons that you're learning here about collaboration. There are lessons that you're learning here about trusting folks downstream with their expertise that will serve you whether you're wearing a uniform or not down the road. Next slide, please. That's Mike Oppum, who is an ATF agent in Newtown. All this happened in the last 3 years. He's an ATF agent in Newtown, which was a horrendous mass shooting, one of over a dozen that have happened on my watch the last 3 years at ATF. This just gives you a flavor of the op tempo, the vibe that goes on with the mission set that we have. It's a very telling photo with the dad and his son there. 20 innocent second graders lost their life. That's a reminder to me in talking to you about not only do people in uniform need quality leadership, but we're all in this together serving public safety. You know, you look at Mike, and I met him up in the office in Bridgeport in New Haven. Humble guy, working cases today on firearms trafficking and gangbangers in New Haven and Bridgeport. Again, moral of the story, the learning point is don't ever forget about your folks that are out there doing the job. There's no separation in terms of the leadership that they deserve to have and your responsibility to make sure they have what they need to do the job, even in the worst of circumstances. Next slide, please. I debated whether or not to put this slide in here. That's my wonderful wife of 35 years now. That's my Marine Corps bride, Margaret, and me taking the oath in August of 2013. Now, I know that you have taken an oath. Special agents take an oath. I've taken it many times as a public servant. That's a reminder to all of us that you have to take that oath seriously. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. But if you stop wearing that uniform, you will find that those who have not served in uniform or out don't always have the same mindset about what an oath like that really means. One of the attractions, and somebody mentioned, why don't you talk about why you've been in and out? I've had 13 years of service in uniform and active duty and reserves. I've been with the Department of Justice as a trial lawyer and prosecutor now for many years. I've been in and out of public service, usually to replenish the bank account, but I love public service. You all love public service. You wouldn't be sitting here. It's not a job. This is not a job. This is a profession. Servant leadership really has to be grounded, and good leaders have to be grounded. And the reason I put that up there, in a strong value system, whatever that is, and some solid relationships in terms of taking care of yourself. I would not be standing up here. I would not have been able to get through the last 3 years. And I've been deployed. My family's in Minnesota. I got 5 kids. They're grown up. I've been deployed for 3.5 years doing this gig. And I love my job because I've taken that oath every time I've done it very seriously in terms of responsibility to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. You all do that. You've done the same thing. But more importantly, to make this world, my community, a little better for my kids, who are probably of the demographic of a number of the cadets here. My oldest is 30, my youngest is 19. Next slide, please. Pat Hill is that young man's dad. Pat Hill is an ATF task force officer in the Detroit Police Department. That's his youngest son. His dad lost his life in the line of duty as a police officer in Detroit in 2013, protecting the community that he serves as a police officer in a pretty tough environment. I have a tough time looking at that picture. Just like the one before it in terms of leadership, lessons learned at a fundamental level, things that you're learning over the next couple days that you've learned in the run-up to being here at the academy, is you have to know yourself, you have to have a solid foundation, you have to have a solid value system, or you're not going to be an effective leader. If you don't know yourself and work toward continual improvement and don't have a solid foundation, the likelihood that you will ever evolve into a great leader is diminished. You know, when I put that picture up, I did it for purposes of really exemplifying for you all what ATF does, what law enforcement does. Because bottom line, the mission that you all have, the mission that ATF has in terms of the violent crime mission, the work we do with state and locals, including that young man's dad who lost his life in the line of duty in a shooting in Detroit. It's very sad. He's there. We're here to serve the public and to keep them safe. This makes it real. You know, the other scene that jumped out, and I know people have seen 12 O'Clock High. Raise your hand if you haven't seen it. Wow, this is the Air Force Academy. 12 O'Clock High is one of the compressed version of some very good leadership lessons, but there's a scene in there where pilot, 21 years old, B-17 pilot, really is struggling with some things that are going on with General Savage, and he literally has to explain to him why we do what we do, Lieutenant Bishop. And it was a reminder to me that sometimes we all forget what's at the core of that mission. I'm just a dumb grunt, okay? Give me the mission. What's the mission? The mission I have now, and the opportunity I have to lead the men and women at ATF, is to make sure that young men and young women like that have safer communities. And to the extent that we can stop, prevent, and bring to justice those who perpetrate gun violence, that's a great mission. That's a mission that tugs at your heart. That's a mission that gives you purpose. You all have a great mission. Anybody wearing the uniform's got a great mission in terms of protecting this country and the rule of law. That little man and the people that he represents in communities across the country deserve safe communities. That's a fantastic mission. That's why we do what we do. Next slide, please. Here's a leadership philosophy. I debated again whether to give you this. This shows you a little bit of where we're at, the learning point in terms of fundamentals from that time in Quantico and things that have lived with me forever. Is it's really important to communicate to your organization consistently what the expectations are. I know they do that here. That doesn't always happen in the civilian world, whether it's in a public or private setting. Those are some of the fundamentals that you all have worked on forever. I will not pain you with, they speak for themselves, character and competence, the leadership philosophy. If you see some of the strains of things that folks that are there now, including myself, hold near and dear, we push that out, and we have that as a very integral part of our communication loop. Because communication, constant communication, and reinforcing that messaging to folks who have not had the opportunity to get it in any other way is very important to have that unity of effort and make sure everybody's in sync with what the overall goal is. Next slide, please. And that's it. I want to close out by telling folks, talking about a quote that I think is really relevant. The Admiral spoke a little bit about it, but it's a quote from Gandhi that maybe you've heard before, that's at the core of some of the things I've talked about. Your beliefs become your thoughts become your words become your actions become your habits become your values become your destiny. For me, I would not be where I'm at, which was completely unexpected, as the director of a federal law enforcement entity, lawyer, former Marine, without being able to draw on some of the lessons I learned early on that have continued to serve me well, that are the fundamentals of leadership. If you ever ask yourself, why are we going through some of this stuff? Why am I learning this? You cannot see, I don't think all the time, what's happening or what has happened to you and the transformation that you've gone through and the expectations that people have for you, whether you're wearing this uniform or not, 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, the life lessons that you are learning here now are very relevant to what you will become down the road. Thank you for your attention, and I don't know if we're going to take questions or not, Luna, but we can do that.
Thank you, Director Jones, for your message, and I'm sure that your many different perspectives on your many different leadership experiences are sure to provide something we can all pull from. At this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor for a few questions, and I'll announce last question until the end.
Hey, good morning, sir. My name is Cadet First Class Stephen Cox. So my question kind of relates to, you mentioned the Boston Marathon bombing. And one thing I kind of noticed specifically after the Boston Marathon bombing was this sort of large, almost sort of military scale response in the city of Boston, with sort of like the vehicles that were going around and stuff like that. And I feel like post 9/11, there's sort of this blending of the line between a serious crime and an act of terrorism. And I think people are kind of worried about sort of the militarization of the police in regards to that. So where do we draw the line between a serious crime and terrorism in order to prevent sort of the inimical effects of a militarized police in a democratic society?
That is a subject of much discussion right now in terms of the militarization of law enforcement post 9/11. And that's really a tough challenge because bottom line, I think everybody wants their community to be safe. We spend as much time working with our colleagues in other law enforcement components, primarily the FBI as the lead on national security issues, on terrorism issues, and when you have challenges like as recently as yesterday, 3 young men trying to fly out of JFK to get to Syria to join ISIL, it's a civilian operation in terms of the indictment that was done in Brooklyn and now the process that will be followed. Those lines are blurring, and it's one that we will continue to struggle with. I think that one of the challenges that we have is the inconsistency in the quality of civilian law enforcement leadership and the lack in some instances of professionalized civilian law enforcement and their ability to enforce the rule of law, staying within constitutional bounds. You see that in places around the country. There is an inconsistency. And how we work through that, in my mind, really relates to some of the topics that you will talk with, that you have talked about and you will continue to talk about. Solid leadership, solid understanding as to what the parameters are, finding and keeping the best people to wear that badge and enforce the law, and making sure that we keep the American public safe in ways that don't violate that constitutional boundary. I know that there are people wearing the uniform that, there are situations where you do have to hit the 911 and have the guard or other things come out and play. And a terrorist event is something that nobody wants to happen. Where we're struggling is how we calibrate right now. And that will continue.
Thank you.
Good morning, sir. My name is Cadet First Class Joshua Wilson, and I was just wondering, how have your experiences in the administration changed your views on gun control?
Gun control. There is this thing called the Second Amendment. There are over 300 million guns in the United States. There is a legal commerce in firearms. We license FELs. We license federal explosives manufacturers. We license firearms manufacturers. It's a reality, always has been since the genesis of the United States. What we're struggling with, I think from a law enforcement standpoint, taking all the politics out of it, is how can we be more effective in both draining the illegal crime gun pool and stopping the migration of guns from the legal commerce to the illegal commerce. Most violent crime in the United States is perpetrated with handguns. There's a huge pool of crime guns that exist out there, and there's technological challenges that are coming. E-commerce is making it real easy to transfer weaponry, and technology is making it easier to actually make firearms that migrate into the illegal market. There's some real challenges out there. I came to the table without, my perspective is as a prosecutor, okay, and as a Marine officer who owns guns. And it's always a little interesting to me to have discussions with folks who, wouldn't know the difference between a revolver and a semi-automatic, and they're talking about gun control. So there's work to be done, not only in the educational front, but an ability, I think, bottom line, and what I've noticed over the last several years, even post-Newtown, with that horrific mass shooting, is you can't have a rational conversation. People get locked in at one extreme or the other, either take all the guns away or everything goes. You can't have a conversation, and that's not a good place to be if you're in our position of having to enhance public safety and try and make communities a little safer by getting illegal guns off the street. You can't even have the political conversation. So it's disappointing, bottom line.
Thank you, sir.
C4C Leaf Joffrey of Cadet Squadron 36. Sir, I grew up in Michigan, and my entire life, the city of Detroit has been known for its violence and its crime. I was wondering what the current plans are to improve the welfare of the city of Detroit and other cities like it.
Well, Detroit's, there's lots of things, and I was talking to some folks backstage about Detroit. Detroit is one of our most active divisions. As I mentioned, Brandon came there. He lived in Detroit. He raised his family in Detroit. He's a graduate of Oakland University. Detroit has gone through some really rough times for a lot of different reasons. City's out of bankruptcy. It may be on the rebound. There are lots of vacant lots, lots of empty houses. Population is going down, and the folks that are left are those who are in the least position to help build it up. So it's going to take a lot of effort to get Detroit back to where it needs to be, both from a public safety standpoint and also just from an economic standpoint. But Detroit's not unlike Cleveland or where I grew up in Cincinnati or East St. Louis, or that's all across the Rust Belt. And until we have some bigger decisions made, all we can do is kind of make sure that we're removing the worst of the worst and following up on what we can do to kind of give them a foundation so it can grow. Detroit's coming back.
Thank you, sir.
They shouldn't have cut Reggie Bush, though.
Good morning, sir. C4C William Duvall with CS33. And I was just wondering, with the large influx of mass shootings, particularly in schools, what is the ATF's standpoint on arming and training teachers? Because most people that I've talked to have argued that the limitations placed on concealed carry in schools and stuff like that have limited teachers' capabilities of defending their students in the event of a shooting.
Well, school safety and the mass shootings, really the thematics that we picked up from a public safety standpoint, the main one is sort of the mental health aspects, which is a very difficult issue. The question was asked about the militarization of law enforcement. The other issue that's out there is sort of how much privacy do you give up in order to maintain some level of safety. I don't have an opinion about arming teachers in schools. I've learned over the last 4 years in D.C. that it's good for me in my position not to have an opinion about things like that. I would, if you have some views or opinions, you can write your congressman or, talk to your state governor or legislator. But the reality is that there's different challenges. I know that there are states west of the Mississippi where it's less controversial, and there's some very practical reasons why you might want to look at that as an option, simply the 911 response time when the sheriff's got to drive 60 minutes to get to a school, as compared to, concentrate in urban areas. But the main issue, I think, the takeaway for me in the mass shootings, over a dozen that have happened, is we've got to get a better handle on who has access to weapons and whether or not we are going to sacrifice a little privacy by putting it in a repository so people can't get access to weapons, or at least we can stop some of it. But as I said before, with 300 million guns out there and the ease with which anyone can get a gun, it's difficult.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
That was a good non-answer. You can see I've been in D.C. for 4 years.
Good morning, sir. Midshipman Second Class Thompson, Marine Option out of Marquette University.
Hoorah.
Hoorah, sir. With the transition from military realm to the civilian realm, how did you modify your leadership?
Well, obviously you don't have a UCMJ in your back pocket, but I never relied on that anyway, in uniform or out. And I think that it really boils down to just always being professional. There are lessons that you learn in the service, irrespective of branch, about how you communicate with people, how you carry yourself, how you just, the way that you process information, that, you don't have to dial it back. You're all going to be, I think, there are enlisted folks here. I had a really aggressive gunnery sergeant who was a platoon sergeant. And I was not, and most of the officers that I served with were not yellers and screamers. But people, when I'm out of uniform or in a suit or in a work environment, they know where you're coming from. I mean, your rep kind of precedes you. And again, the lessons that I learned in uniform have consistently served me well out of uniform. And so the leadership style that has developed really hasn't had to be calibrated in normal day-to-day work environment. My sons say I can tune it up, though.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, sir. C1C Cooner from Cadet Squadron 34. My question for you this morning is, with the advent of 3D printing technology, there have been some blueprints out there that people have distributed through the internet that allow basically anyone with a 3D printer to manufacture firearms in their home. Does the ATF have any plans to regulate that kind of activity?
No, because it is legal to manufacture a weapon for your own personal use, just like it's legal to brew your own beer or make your own wine. Cody Wilson has sort of put out over the internet the plans, the technologies there, the Liberator gun that's out there, the plastics, the technology hasn't evolved to the point where, from an ATF violent crime perspective, it's risen to a high threat. Now, you talk to folks who are in the protective business, yes, undetectable firearms are a challenge. I think from a technology standpoint, the bigger challenge for us right now, we're seeing the phenomena on the West Coast, particularly in California, where it's, the wait period for assault rifle platform weapons. There's a lot of what we call ghost guns or shake and bake assault rifles that are going. The CNC machinery, the availability of component parts that are completely unregulated, and the ability of folks to essentially mass produce weapons is a phenomena that's very troubling because, of course, if you're illegally manufacturing, then it sort of deconstructs the whole construct about manufactured and licensed. You can't trace the guns, they're not marked, you don't know where they're coming from, and it just compounds the problem already with respect to weaponry that's available to criminals. Okay?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good morning, sir. Cadet 3rd Class, Dan Gaines, Cadet 120. Sir, my question is, when you first entered the ATF, you said there was like a culture where people were afraid to speak out about corruption, and you eradicated that culture to make sure there weren't whistleblowers and that you solved problems internally. Now that you're not the new guy and people are becoming more comfortable with leadership, how do you ensure that people don't become too comfortable that they fear bringing up problems?
Well, I mean, the genesis of my arrival there really had its down in the Phoenix Field Division where Brandon was at, really was a classic whistleblower scenario that ended up morphing into a congressional inquiry, and the rest is history. But, some of the things that we've done post-arrival, we've strengthened the Ombuds program. We've the Leadership Institute so that We have a succession plan and a construct in place so that people are getting the benefit of shared knowledge in a common way. And we basically have listened to people more. I mean, you know, it's weird. When I got there at ATF, it had, as part of its culture, a real lockstep of command and control. Somebody asked the question about, you know, in law enforcement organizations, it's not uncommon to have it be a very structured, military-like command and control process. You don't say anything to anybody that's not the next person in your chain of command. You know, and you know, there's necessity for that in some circumstances when you're in uniform, and even in law enforcement, which is quasi-paramilitary, dare I say. But you still have to have the fundamentals of solid leadership in there. You still have to believe in and emulate and model servant leadership as compared to the what's in it for me kind of leadership. And so some of those fundamentals have resolved the issues, many of which were very important that just didn't have an outlet. So structurally, there's an ombuds program. We have communication channel. I have a director's comment page, and talking about leveraging technology. Anybody can send me an email, and I read them. It's like Lincoln said, that's the public bath. Since I've been there, and I look at them and I dole them out, keeping the names confidential, and it's been a great way for me to stay in touch with what's happening on a regular basis and have people bring up concerns, whether it's a good idea or whether it's something that's not quite right. And usually it's an HR kind of problem, somebody feeling bad about something that happened. But the key to making sure that you got a high-functioning organization, military or not, is a wide open communication loop and a lack of fear to hear feedback.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, Cadet 4th Class Schmidt from Cadet Squadron 38. I was just going to ask about, you talked about having a rational discussion on gun rights and gun safety. With the recent controversy on the M855 ball ammunition, what is
Wow,
your...
somebody reads the Federal Register or goes to ATF's website. What, are you stockpiling green tip now? I heard the price went up.
So, sir, I'm just wondering what your... how do you balance like gun safety, the public safety, and also the gun rights? Because that's a round used by millions of Americans.
Where are you from, sir?
Seattle, Washington.
You know, you've got some congressional representation and folks that you should ask that question to.
So, do you have any opinion on that?
You learn as a political appointee that your personal opinions sometimes are better kept to yourselves until you're no longer a political appointee.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Cadet Herbert, Arizona State University. So I just want to double hash on that question. What kind of research goes into it from your standpoint for the most
For
recent
me
case?
personally,
From your bureau.
a lot.
But more in particular, like the case of the XM855.
There is a window that opened last week for public comment. We are taking public comment for a process to make these kind of determinations. And, you know, I'm not being coy or anything, but I'm a lawyer. There is this thing called the Administrative Procedures Act. ATF does get sued. The throttle's wide open for all kinds of comment, and there'll be some decisions made once the regulatory process runs its course. So I am not at liberty to talk about anything that the Firearms Technology Division in Martinsburg or any of the other discussions that have gone on about 5.56 ball.
Thank you.
Wow, you got a lot of gun strokes here at Air Force Academy.
Sir, I'm C3C Burgess. Actually looking at cross commission to the Marine Corps out of the Air Force. I was wondering.
What?
I was wondering if you could talk on a little more on your experience with leadership in the Marine Corps and going through the basic school.
Oh, I spent a lot of time, and I think one of the things that I treasure about my time is I got out as a major. The best opportunity I had was to be the CEO of MP Company, 4th MARDIV, grunts with badges up in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities. And I never had to go into higher headquarters and do the head shed kind of stuff. I had a lot of, it's what you call tactical command opportunities. So I really am, the experiences I have are really driven on the operational level. It's only been the last 10 years or so that the strategery aspect has come into it. That's been not a challenge, but I think it's helpful to have that level of granularity about, for lack of a better term, small unit leadership. Whether it's scale and scope of 5,000 FTE badge carriers or not at ATF, or whether it's, a platoon of 30. There's some fundamentals that you pick up, scale and scope aside, that are part of what I've talked about here in terms of knowing your folks. And granted, you can't know all 5,000 folks, but, sort of at its core, again, leadership's about people. People are complex, they're complicated, they have different needs, wants. Trying to figure out how to get them to all pull in the same direction is a little bit of art, but there's a lot of books, a lot of experiences, a lot of people that you can go to kind of get back to those fundamentals. The things that I talked about, whether it's when I walked into Weapons Platoon 17, or whether it's walking into ATF headquarters 3.5 years ago, mission, focus, discipline, expectations and accountability, mentoring. These are all things that private, public, military, law enforcement, any high-performing organization's leadership is spending time thinking about. So, those core lessons, things that you're picking up here, are going to serve you well from now on. Last question, Luna.
Well, we have time for one more question after yours, sir.
Thank you very much for coming to speak with us today. A common critique I've heard of our current drinking age of 21 is that someone can go to war for their country at 18 but not be able to drink a beer. How might you reply to such a criticism?
Drinking age was 18 when I went to college. Hey, I got 3 sons, okay? So my perspective has changed over the years. I'm all for 21. My son once, my second son, this is this knucklehead. He was in college. He's a Greek life, okay? He's out on the West Coast. He has the smarts to show dad, because his 21 drinking state, obviously, his fake ID. His dad, the federal prosecutor. Proud as hell. Dad, check out this quality of this license here. Mike Jones, is at 21. And then he was mad at me when I wouldn't give it back to him. So, it might cut into the fake ID business a little bit, but there's workarounds. Not that I'm advocating any of them. I just know the reality with all of my children. Luna, are we ready to go?
Thank you, sir.
Before I get any more deeply personal questions about things like guns or alcohol, or nobody's going to ask me about marijuana legalization in the District of Columbia?
Actually, sir, that's
No.
What do you see the federal government doing to get ahead of the states legalizing marijuana?
You must mistake me for Michelle Linhart, the administrator of the DEA.
You don't see the marijuana falling under ATF?
I am no. Nice try.
Thank you again, Director Jones. On behalf of the 2015 NCLS participants, the cadet wing, and the faculty and staff here at the Air Force Academy, we'd like to present to you a small token of our appreciation.
Oh, this is beautiful. Thank you so much. This way.